All right, good afternoon, everyone. I would probably start by apologizing. I'm between you and the end of the day, right? So I'll do my best to kind of keep you engaged. And my name's Samesh Singh. I'm an architect with the Microsoft Consulting Organization. I work in an area that basically focuses on Windows deployment, enterprise mobility, and Windows devices as well. So it sort of spans a fairly wide breadth. Just a couple of things before I get started. I'm happy to take questions as we go along. All I ask is please make your way to the microphone. The session is being recorded, so we'd love to get your questions recorded as well, and I'll do my best to get you an answer. If I can't, come and see me after the session, and we'll work out some kind of comms to be able to get an answer back to you. So we're going to talk about preparing your infrastructure for the deployment of Windows 10. There's a fair bit of information I'm going to try and cram in here today. Some of it may change, but it's more than likely that everything that we discuss here will set you on the right path and get you ready to deploy as soon as the rest of the organization is ready to adopt. So looking at what we're going to cover today, we're going to talk about devices and deployment. We'll talk about management and security, identity, and the cloud. That probably doesn't sound too much like the title, but as we get a couple of slides in, I'll show you how we approach it and why it's being categorized this way in the outline. We have a framework that we use to try and articulate what the infrastructure is and which parts of the infrastructure we're going to be working with. You'll see these little tips pop out at the bottom of some of the slides. This is just a pointer to other sessions that we'd probably recommend you go and attend, or it may be information that's not really covered here in a great deal of depth or not even covered at all. But we think it might be useful for you to go and follow up on these sessions. There is no room number. The reason for that is the room numbers may change. So search by the presenter's name, which is generally after the by, and you should be able to get that content. So in this case, it's the preparing for Windows 10 deployment, focusing on the app compat and planning parts of it. So we're going to look at more the infrastructure elements. So for most of us, what's kind of happened previously is we've started at some n-1 state. And I'm going to use a corporate device in this instance because that's really what most of us, or most of you rather, are using today. Then you look to the next operating system. And at that point, it's N for the version, and it comes across with a few new features. So you start your prep work looking at how you're going to migrate to that operating system. There are two parts that you can take here. The first is some level of effort, planning, complexity, that will get you to really have what you have on n-1 to get you to n. So you haven't really looked at the new features at that point. In most cases, that tends to be a relatively easy task in some instances. In some cases, it can be very, very challenging. And so that's still an ongoing basis. You do need to get to n, or you will migrate to n. And then there's the new feature piece. And in most cases, the clarity on that piece generally comes after the operating system's released. So we're going to try and help you get a view to what those new features are, what some of them may require from your infrastructure. And I mean, I guess we have very varied n-1 states, n-m states, I guess. So I'm not going to say that it's going to be painless, but I'm going to say that we absolutely understand this problem at Microsoft, and we're taking it very seriously with Windows 10 during its development. And so we're trying to minimize the gradients, if you like, on these two triangles. And hopefully, at the end of this session, you'll probably share that view as well, that we've actually tried to minimize the impact to your organization and to your IT operations. So really, it's the end state that will determine how much of work needs to be done, and that's really the way it's been. There's a second consideration we need to have, which is taking that same model of the corporate device and looking at the corporate device, and I call it XYOD. We've got the bring your own device, the choose your own device, the on your own device in some cases. We're really looking at Windows 10 to kind of fill all of those gaps, and there is going to be some level of effort to get there. And that's what I want to try and talk to today. You'll notice that here there's these other new feature pieces. And I say new features, it could be some level of updates, but it's some new element that's being brought in to Windows 10, and it's this continuous innovation piece. We will continue to add it, and I think some announcements have been made through keynotes at Build, as well as yesterday, that relate to these. So what we're trying to do is really, instead of having the gradients on these triangles pile up on you, we want to try and make it a pretty simple move in the first instance to get you, in some cases, what you have today on Windows 10, so at least you're at a solid foundation, and to set you up for these very small deltas that will come periodically. So this continuous innovation piece is where Microsoft is investing. We're going to ensure that coming out to you will be at a greater cadence. So there will be change, but I think it's something that we're working very hard on to try and minimize business impact, to try and minimize expenditure. So I mentioned that I'll talk to you about the agenda, and this is really the agenda slide. And if we deconstruct the device, we're going to look at it through all of these layers. So we're going to start pretty much at the bottom of this stack, at the device. We're going to work our way up to the operating system and Windows 10 itself. And then since Windows 8, we've had this split identity that you've been able to have on a Windows device. You've had, out of the box, I guess, the personal stack there, where I have a personal identity, either a local account, which you may consider a personal identity, but really it was focusing on the Microsoft account, which you needed to log into the system and to be able to transact with services that enabled the Windows 8 and 8.1 ecosystem. What we have now in Windows 10, or rather just before I get to 10, you then did a domain join, or you built into the domain and excluded the personal identity. And that really enabled the stack on your right-hand side. So we layer it up in this way to really show these main components, and in most cases, it's really the key capabilities that IT needs to be able to deliver that consistent, seamless user experience. So I'm going to walk through most of these layers today. And then, of course, the gray box, the management stack, we'll definitely address as well. So that's really the agenda for this session, and we'll sort of take it from there. So let's start with devices and deployment. And I'm putting them together because really, once you have a device, there has to be an operating system of some sort, whether that comes in from the OEM, or whether you're deploying a custom image, or you're using some of the new capabilities that will be in Windows 10. So I spoke a bit about the standard deployment. And this is really if you want to take what you have today in terms of capabilities and take that onto Windows 10. The requirements from a device point of view really remains very similar to Windows 7. There are some exceptions, and I think we'll document those on TechNet very clearly. But really, the main requirements there were around BitLocker and the Windows display driver model. And that was version 1.1. Version 1 was released with Vista, and then 1.1 with Windows 7. From a firmware point of view, what you needed was either an up-to-date BIOS that supported, in some cases, the use of small files and the ability to boot from a USB device if you were using something like Windows To Go, or you could use UEFI. And just to kind of look out here, how many of you have deployed Windows 7 with UEFI configured? Okay, so we'll talk, because I think that's actually a better position to be in. And I'll discuss why on some later slides. We understand that in most cases, it's been deployed with a BIOS configuration on the device. And that sort of sets you up. You can still be successful with Windows 10, but it comes down to what are the new features that require UEFI. And then there's the TPM 1.2, right? That was required for BitLocker. It was part of the TCG spec, and we leveraged that to secure your data when it was at rest on the device. Then we look at Windows 10 and its features. And so I kind of like to think about this as the modernizing migration. This is where you're really migrating to Windows 10 for some of these extended features or the new features that it's going to be delivering. And that's really to list some of them out there. But really, these features are the ones that are going to drive the hardware change, the changes in the device. So as I mentioned, if you're looking at, and it's not necessarily BitLocker on this case, so I'll probably point that out that you can still have BitLocker with BIOS and a TPM 1.2. But if you're looking at using Microsoft Passport, Virtual Secure Mode, that's effectively leveraging the hypervisor. So you need to be able to run the hypervisor on the device. Secure Boot, Device Guard are technologies that will leverage the TPM. Secure Boot specifically and Device Guard are going to require UEFI. And that's really to ensure that Secure Boot is the first part of the chain of trust, and we then trust the system, and then we're able to ensure that there's security within the operating system when Device Guard is enabled. The display driver model, that goes up to version 2, and there's been a tremendous amount of work put into Windows 10 to try and preserve application and driver compatibility. In most cases, actually, how many of you are running in the Windows Insider program? Awesome stuff. How many of you had really breaking change? Let's exclude DisplayLink for now. We know that that has had a fairly big impact. How many of you have really had major applications fail on you? Okay, that's fantastic. And I apologize, I don't mean it in that way, but what I'm kind of getting at is that's how much of an investment Microsoft is putting in, that we're only getting about 2 or 3 hands up in the room. We understand that drivers do pose a bit of a challenge, but in most cases they've actually been pretty good. The compatibility level has been pretty good. And with regards to DisplayLink, in recent builds, it's become far more stable. So for instance, it doesn't bug check the system when you disconnect a DisplayLink or reconnect a DisplayLink dock. So there were some challenges. Those have been remediated. So that's kind of the 2 models and the 2 themes I'm going to carry through the entire presentation around this notion of a standard deployment, which for a colloquialism, I'll go lift and shift. And if you'd like to modernize on those new features that Windows 10 is bringing in. So from a deployment point of view, do you wipe the system or do you upgrade the system? And this is some data that has been presented from Microsoft IT. And this kind of looks at the different solutions we've had as delivered to our own users internally. So around the Windows 7 time, we had a custom solution. And you'll see that basically those 3 graphs are looking at complexity of the solution, the user experience, and the number of help desk calls effectively. And you will notice that as we move to the right, the user satisfaction has increased tremendously. And that's a fantastic piece. When we think about IT today, it's a consumer-driven industry. Everything revolves around that user. Enterprise mobility is all about the user. So what we've really seen is, as we moved away from custom solutions and toward this upgrade model, we just got a better and better user experience, and it also drove adoption because we made it less painful for them. We allowed them to continue with their work. So in this instance, what we're really trying to get at is it's probably better if the appropriate checks have been put in place to really look at the upgrade model. Now, I did ask the question earlier around UEFI and BIOS, and we'll come to that in a little while. So what do you need to think about when you're considering an in-place upgrade? And this is an area, again, that engineering has put a significant amount of effort into, and in experience for a lot of folks that I've spoken to, it's been a very good experience. So let's kind of think about the items that you need to consider. The device. If you are happy with the devices that you have today, if they are configured appropriately, if they meet the hardware specifications that you need, either to lift and shift or to be able to modernize, then we'll put those checks against it effectively. So the upgrade process will perform a series of hardware checks, and at that point, you'll pass the hardware check piece. The operating system, if the configuration is appropriate, if you're happy that it complies as closely to your baselines as possible, that's a great story as well. That means you're effectively in a position where you're ready to upgrade. And then it's the apps piece. And I mentioned we're not going to talk too much about the apps today, but if the compatibility is pretty high through your testing for the installed apps, the store apps that you may have installed, and also for browser applications, you're pretty much in a good place. I will add one other piece to this, that the most expeditious path to Windows 10 today is to ensure that you have IE 11 in play today in your organization. Windows 10 will ship with Internet Explorer 11. It will also ship with Microsoft Edge, as was disclosed last week at Build. But if you are on IE 11 in your organization today, your browser apps have a very, very good chance of being compatible in Windows 10. And that's been most of the data that the IE team has seen. So if, based on your checks, you effectively pass these, and I'll come to the caveats on the next slide, you're basically set to do an in-place upgrade. And that in-place upgrade is effectively run off Microsoft-provided media. It cannot use a custom image. It cannot use a modified image. But effectively, that in-place upgrade will then download the binaries onto the user's machine and will invoke the process from within the operating system. That in-place upgrade, depending on the amount of data in play, can be as quick as about 20 minutes and as long, well, I probably wouldn't put an end time on that because it really does depend on whether you're using SSDs or spindles or whether you have data across multiple drives. So there's a whole myriad of variables that will determine how long that process will take. So as good as an in-place upgrade is, we think that there's actually still going to be a need for this wipe and load. And I'm going to try and go through a couple of scenarios based on those 3 boxes we looked at on the previous slide to try and understand what some of those things are so you can effectively start to think about what you would really like to do to get Windows 10 in your organization. So we're going to go across the device, the OS, and the apps, and in-place upgrade is not really an option for you if you meet any of these criteria or you choose to apply them. So the first is, if you do want to use any of those new features that require UEFI and you need to modify your system to change from legacy boot or to make it boot into UEFI only, well, that's changing the firmware. That's going to change the disk structure, and therefore, you're going to have to do a wipe and load on those systems. If you want to change the disk layout, independent of UEFI, if you have multiple partitions today and you'd like to consolidate that, that's also a scenario where an in-place upgrade will not be viable. And then if you have some custom elements in Windows PE, some custom processing that you need to perform or must perform, that's effectively going to rule it out as well. And that new device scenario, it's effectively a wipe and load. Then we get to the operating system. So if you're planning on moving from 32-bit to 64-bit, there is no in-place upgrade for that. If you have multiple base languages that aren't in the language that you are trying to do the upgrade from, that's going to sort of defeat the purpose as well. So this is really the list. Now, also, if you're below Windows 7 RTM, so XP and Vista, in most cases, that's going to really require a wipe and load as well, because Windows 7 RTM is the minimum requirement for an in-place upgrade. The most important one here, I think, is the custom image. In order to ensure that a device meets a particular baseline or usability baseline before it enters your environment, you've effectively been building images, and that's really been the gold standard. So if you have a need for that custom image, then effectively it's going to be a wipe and load. And then finally, there's the apps. If you are going to go through a bulk app change, there's really no point in doing an in-place upgrade because you're going to migrate those apps, and then you're just going to have to rip and replace them all. So these are some of those areas that we think will deviate more toward a wipe and load than to an in-place upgrade. Now, this can be pretty quick as well. So it's just a matter of, do you fit into any of these criteria? Sure. What is the local admin restriction? So this is really about configuration drift. Over a period of time, you may have had additional users added to the local admin group. We're not going to remove those users. We're just going to leave them in place, and we will just perform the upgrade. So it's really about compliance to your baseline and whether you have tolerance for the configuration drift that is in play on those systems. Question?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify. Are you talking about physical workstations, or are you also considering VDI?
VDI.
Yeah.
So this is really physical workstations when I talk about the device. In VDI, we've effectively isolated the disk partition anyway. But in VDI, you really wouldn't perform an in-place upgrade anyway.
Yeah, I just wanted to, to clarify overall what you're talking about. Is it just physicals mostly, or are you going to also talk about VDI as well?
That is just physicals. Thank you very much for the question. Okay, so it effectively goes down to that refresh scenario where you're going to back up user state, wipe and load the operating system, and then restore the user state. So therefore, if we need an image, well, let's try and look at some of the impacts to what your imaging process is today. So this is really just looking at the tools, and I'm going to try and talk to all of them. So WSIM is a tool that you should really use when you're considering building. So the Windows ADK for Windows 10 ships with the Windows Imaging and Configuration Designer. Let's call it Wicked from now on. It just sounds cool, right? So WSIM, as it has shipped previously, will remain in there, and that's really if you want to continue to build images and build under 10 files for Windows 7 or Windows 8 or 8.1. Wicked, on the other hand, is now the tool of preference for Windows 10 and is a tool that will be used for creating and for configuring images and building those under 10 files. DISM, the Deployment and Image Servicing and Management tool, that's undergone a couple of changes. Nothing that will really be significantly impactful to scripts that are using DISM today, but there are some changes that support the new provisioning technology for Windows 10. And I'll cover that later on. MDT, it does rely on the ADK, and so if the ADK changes, MDT needs to change. There were some announcements yesterday at the keynote, so I would suggest that you basically follow on with that for the preview. Configuration Manager, that matrix is probably too hard for me to talk about, but I have a slide later on, because there's quite a few things to consider all the way from Configuration Manager 2007 all the way to what's potentially vNext. Within the context of creating an image, we would recommend that MDT is the preferred tool to create that image, because it does allow you to do a lot more and doesn't operate within the system context, as well as being able to use System Center. If that is your tool of choice, then the ADK has changed, and therefore you will need to update that as well. USMT does have some changes, and I will show you those one specific change that actually becomes quite powerful when you're looking at an upgrade scenario. And the recovery image. In Windows 10, there is no recovery image. So if you have investments in the recovery image as part of the deployment, we actually remove that partition. So speaking of USMT, we have these two new switches, or it's effectively a new capability. So there's a /drivers switch. That will allow USMT to extract drivers from the system during the scan state phase. Those drivers can be extracted and stored in the state store. Alternatively, you can specify the PPKG switch with drivers, and that will extract the drivers and create a provisioning package out of them. Now, that provisioning package will then, you can use it with DISM and inject it back into another Windows 10 install.wim file. So effectively, you're able, and that's how the in-place upgrade works. It extracts it and then uses it, and then the system has all the drivers as soon as it boots. So that's the really two big things I wanted to draw your attention to with regards to USMT. So I'll try and show you that really quickly. On my demo system. Number 8. So what I have out here are basically two technical preview builds, and we'll just be using them for different things. I mentioned that we'll use the deployment and imaging tools. This is a command setup that's really been installed as part of the Windows ADK. Now, just to check, can everybody at the back see the text that's up here? If you can, please raise your hands. Okay, I'll try and make it a little bit bigger. Okay, any better? Yep, thank you. So we're going to head into the user state migration tool, and this is a 32-bit image I'm running, so I'll go into the x86 directory, and I'm going to try and make this a little more readable. There we go. So it's going to be a scan state. I'm going to try and get these right, /drivers/ppkg. We don't want to grab any of the user data, so we need to exclude that. And where do we want to put that package file? So I have a folder here. And that will basically run through scan the system and will generate a provisioning package that will be stored in that location that I've specified. So this is a fairly clean virtual machine, so it will run relatively quickly. The provisioning package we can then use with DISM and inject it into our image. So it's a fairly seamless process, and there you go. At that point, it's done. So let's go have a look in that location, and you'll see that that's effectively the file that's been generated. So it's 13 meg running in a virtual machine that's running on Hyper-V. So there's almost no drivers. I ran that on a Surface Pro 1, and it extracted about 300 meg of drivers. So, expect that there'll be large provisioning package files that are the result of this process. Question?
On a restore, Windows 10 has a newer version of the driver. Does it overwrite? Skip it?
So the question is, on a restore, if Windows 10 has a later version of the driver, does it skip it or replace it? Great question. I think that it will replace it, and we'll use the inbox drivers, because there is a driver waiting that will be used. Okay? Here we go. Okay, so since we've spoken about the package files, let's talk a bit about provisioning. Windows 10 brings in this new feature, provisioning, and there's a whole provisioning engine that's in the operating system. What it really is, and this is to kind of describe it at the high level, is if I'm a corporate user and there's a baseline that I have to meet, and I'm in the field and my device fails, it's kind of an extreme scenario, but for the case in point, I think it works. I should really be able to go down to the local, electronics mart, pick up a device, and bring it up to a certain baseline to get me working. There are some other scenarios around this, I have new devices and I want to provision them more easily. What we're really trying to achieve here, and we will continue to invest in provisioning, is to try and reduce the dependency on the imaging process. It's an intensive process. It is fraught with complexity at some instances, and sometimes you just got to do things manually. I think we've seen a number of things that are done just to get the image working. So with provisioning, what we're really working with is the provisioning engine, as well as then interfacing with the subsystems that will be used to configure features and install software, as well as perhaps bootstrap into an MDM service. So you effectively look at the scenario of, I grab the hardware, I have a provisioning package. Those can be very small, they can be larger, depending on how much you pack into it. And then the device is ready for use. It's met some kind of baseline. Alternatively, I could have a system that's running, and I could apply a runtime provisioning package to it. So while I'm in the OS, being relatively non-destructive to the user's data, I can move that system to a compliant state. Applying a provisioning package can be done in quite a few ways. You can use an SD card, you can mail it to the user, NFC, QR tags, and it can even come directly out of the cloud. So there's quite a few options on how you get that provisioning package onto the device. So when we look at it today, what really happens with the device when you unbox it? It runs through its mini setup, its out-of-box experience. It then basically jumps straight into the personal stack, right? Create a local user or sign in with your Microsoft account if you have network connectivity. How cool would it be if we could, well, actually before how cool it, jump the gun on that one. We then join it to a domain, or we then try and meet some level of compliance with the corporate identity. But how cool would it be if we were able to take that management service and effectively drop out the personal side of it completely? So effectively, when that device comes out of the box, we bootstrap directly into the corporate configuration. Then your management system, based on your policies, could or could not disable the personal stack. So that's really what we're trying to get to, is that instead of having to go all the way up the personal side and then jump into the corporate side, let's just go straight into the corporate side. And this applies for Windows as well as Windows 10 Mobile. So that's really what the goal of provisioning is. And then we can do runtime provisioning. So as we version elements off from the deploy time provisioning, we can then do runtime provisioning. So while the operating system's live, we can start to modify elements within the operating system. It's basically what we do with group policy. It's kind of what we do with our more enterprise tools like Configuration Manager. It's runtime configuration, except in this case, it's provisioning. So let's have a quick look at what runtime provisioning looks like and how we set that up. Okay, so we use Wicked. If it will start up, here we go. And we create a new provisioning package. We'll call this Ignite Demo. In this case, it will be common settings that are common to Windows. There will be specific settings that will be associated with Windows Mobile as well. We don't need to import a provisioning package, and we're set up and ready to go. So you'll see that there are quite a few elements that are available in here. Now, while the tool is still in development, there are some items here that will be used for creating an image and some that will be used for provisioning, and that will become clearer as the UI and the tool is refined. What we're really looking for here in this example is settings node, and you'll see down here that we can provision certificates, we can run commands on the system, we can provision connectivity profiles, and a whole host of others. What we're going to do here is we're going to take a system, and I'll just show you the system before I go on. This one here. And if we run into the settings panel very quickly, and we go to About, you'll see down here, it says that it's Windows 10 Pro Insider Preview. We're going to provision this system, so this is runtime provisioning, and we're going to take it up to Enterprise. And that's been one of the biggest challenges you face. That's one of the reasons that imaging is really about, is that most of your devices are purchased with the professional edition of the operating system on it. And to get Enterprise, which is an upgrade right, you're effectively having to re-image the device. So in this scenario, we need an upgrade edition product key. You're probably going to get this off your volume licensing site. It's effectively your VLK. So here's one that I prepared earlier, I believe. Okay, this is the trial key that is publicly available. So it is not a personal key. All right. I'm going to paste it in there. You'll notice on the right-hand side, it's actually pulled all the information in, and I will go export. So that's the only item that we're changing. You'll see in here that I can change the package owner and specify who it comes from. I can also version the package. If I'm putting certificates or other sensitive information in here, I could enable package encryption, and that will automatically generate a complex password for me. If I choose to sign the package, I could provide a certificate and sign that package as well. So we do that, and we click Build, and that's it. It's basically built out that package for us. So you'll see down here that executable, or what looks like an executable, is actually a runtime provisioning package. So let's head over to the machine that we probably can impact. And we're going to go find that package really quickly. Oh, here it is. And all I'm going to do is double-click, or I pressed Enter in this instance. It does recognize, so the provisioning tool is invoked through the file type association. I go yes. You'll see it tells me that something's going to happen, and this is the categories of things that are going to be impacted by this package. So I'm going to click Allow. And for now, it doesn't tell you what it's doing. Suffice to say, something is happening. So what's happening in the background is that the provisioning the provisioning engine has parsed out the necessary configuration, that configuration changes, and it's being pushed down into in this case, the Windows Anytime upgrade. So it's actually performing that upgrade right now. Now, at some point when that device comes back, we'll have a check and see if that's out at the enterprise SKU. Okay, so what do you need to do and what do you need to think about if you'd like to use provisioning? The main use case for provisioning is really to bootstrap into your MDM solution. So you can provide all of the connectivity information, the discovery service, and a bulk enrollment set of credentials, and you have that one package. So if you're looking very much at Windows 10 as part of your mobility arsenal, those devices, any Windows 10 device that can run the provisioning package, will basically be able to come up to that baseline and be bootstrapped directly into your MDM solution without having to get the user to go through that process. So today, in most cases, you've got to go and the user's got to provide their credentials and maybe they've got to know some other information. So non-domain join, non-MDM, Windows 10, BYOD, really, that's really what we're talking about. Bring your own Windows device, let's put it that way. Also, out-of-box compliance. I mentioned earlier on that one of the reasons for needing an image, and that device comes onto your network, it is at a state that is approved by the organization. And what we're really trying to get at here is that with provisioning, you can supply that package to a non-domain joined system or a system that your network knows nothing about, and you can get that box to a level of compliance. Now, when I say a level of compliance, it's really relative to what part of the organization that device will be used in. So there will be some policy exceptions more than technical exceptions at that point. So configuration service providers. In Windows 10, there's this whole MDM subsystem, and the interface into the MDM subsystem are called configuration service providers. CSPs, not to be confused with credential service providers, which are part of the logon experience. And so what we're looking at here is which CSPs would you need to use, and based on what they can do to ensure that you are reaching that level of compliance. So we've just published excuse me, information to TechNet and MSDN relating to the CSPs as well as the OMA URIs that relate to them. And I'll talk more about OMA URIs later on. And then finally, it's about reviewing your image. So if you know the state of your image today and what level of compliance it's bringing the system up to, combined with what the CSPs can achieve for you, you may very well be able to get to Windows 10 using just the provisioning package and not necessarily having an entire image. So just before we jump into Windows management, let's have a look at this device. So we're hoping, looking at my can here today, it says showstopper. I hope that isn't it. All right. And for those of you that can't really see down the bottom right, if we head down here and we go to About, you'll see that this is now a Windows 10 Enterprise Edition. So that's as easy as it can be to get your device from Pro to Enterprise. Sound like a cool feature to have? Maybe? Okay. So let's try and build a structure to how we're going to talk about Windows management. If we look at the client itself, it has oodles, if I might use that term, of ways to manage it. It's got WMI, it's got WinRM to make WMI remotable, it's got PowerShell, which makes everything remotable, it's got group policy, which is good for your domain, it's got MDM capabilities now as well. And that MDM parity exists between Windows 10 Mobile and Windows 10. And then, of course, there's AppLocker, which will really tie in with group policy as well. So if we've got the client, and that's what's in box, then what else do we need to really be concerned about when it comes to preparing our infrastructure? Well, for Windows Server, there are three really big things that are in use. One is Active Directory. So where does the machine belong, and where does the user belong? And then the ability to deploy group policies. So, and we'll touch on these as we go through the slides. And of course, then there's WSUS as well for updatability. We then layer some other software on top of that, which might be Configuration Manager, or you may be using MDOP to be able to manage those devices even further. And then you get the last piece, which is the cloud services, which can go directly to the client and not necessarily through the server or the server software. And so that really involves Azure Active Directory, Intune, and Azure RMS as well. So there are quite a few elements around that. And we've got investments in the Windows Store that leverages Azure Active Directory to be able to look at the app management aspect as well. So let's start with the local management piece. And this is really the management architecture, if you like, of Windows 10. So at the top level, you'll see we're really looking at what is the service or server that will be performing the management of the system. I'll probably start from your left. We've got the MDM client. That MDM client will really work with Microsoft Microsoft Intune. It will work with MobileIron or AirWatch, but that's basically the route through which OMA URIs and OMA DM instructions will be passed. The provisioning engine, as I've showed you, has its own engine, but still works through the common device configurator. EAS, that continues to work as it has, and then we've got this thing called the WMI bridge. The WMI bridge is a way for Configuration Manager to manage all of the MDM elements within Windows 10. So you'll see that the WMI bridge via the CDC is able to communicate with any of the CSPs. And that was part of the announcement that was mentioned yesterday. So if you get a chance to go and grab the tech preview for Configuration Manager, this is the kind of manageability scenario that you'll really see. And then you've got WMI providers, which have been augmented and extended as well. So I think I've actually spoken to that already. And then Janani has a session on MDM in depth, and I think that's on Thursday. So what's the impact of all of this stuff that we've kind of discussed within your organization? The big areas are activation, group policy. I think that's probably not necessarily as big a deal for Windows 10, but it's really about rationalizing and compacting group policy. And one of the areas that you probably do want to think about is if you're using WMI filters to filter operating systems today, that's the first place to go and look for potential issues that you will face. And the other is, of course, you've got to update the ADMX and ADML files in your policy definitions or your sysvol. Regarding activation, there are no changes to the methods by which you can activate Windows 10. So the way you would activate Windows 8 and 8.1 persists with Windows 10. So you can do the Active Directory-based activation, you can use a KMS, you can use a Mac, and you can use the VAMT. For Windows Server Update services, as much as I would love to share more information about Windows Update for Business, I've got that right, I don't actually have any more information just yet apart from what we've published on the blog. But I think the commitment to that is really to ensure that there's a publicly accessible capability that meets the business needs as compared to a device that is necessarily always within your organization, which is the role that WSUS really performs today. For Active Directory, there are no changes that you will need in Active Directory if you are doing a lift and shift. So your Active Directory will remain unchanged. However, these are the two scenarios that you will need changes for. And actually, let me just go back to this slide. The reason Active Directory is up there, and I'm going to have to go to my cheat sheet here because there's just so many items I've got to kind of consider. Server 2003 goes end of life in July this year. Server 2008 and 2008 R2 goes into extended support went into extended support in January this year. So in terms of mainstream support, we're really at 2012 and 2012 R2. So the Active Directories that are based on the out-of-support operating system, Server 2003, will need an update. So if you're at a supported version of Active Directory, there will be no impact on your Active Directory if you are doing the lift and shift, except for these two. So Microsoft Passport, has everybody heard of Passport? Yep, Okay. So there are some requirements around this, and again, I'm going to have to look at my notes to make sure that I've got absolutely the right information here. Passport can operate in two modes. It can operate in a key-based authentication mode, or it can operate in a certificate-based authentication mode. Then, depending on whether you are a hybrid identity, i.e. you're using Azure Active Directory or you're just on-prem, there are some slightly different changes. If you use Passport in a key-based authentication model, then you will need to have a few Windows 10 domain controllers. If you use Passport in certificate-based authentication, you will need to have a PKI infrastructure, and you will need to have a schema update. So that's the two scenarios that you need to consider for Passport. For EDP, there are some changes, but they really require you to have domain controllers that have the schema extensions to support the EDP and the tagging of data. So that's the two features in Windows 10 that will, excuse me, that will sort of suggest that you need to consider an Active Directory change before adopting Windows 10. So I mentioned Configuration Manager, and I'll go back to that now. We've got support for Windows 10 management, and then we've got supporting deployment. If you're at 2012, or System Center 2012 Configuration Manager, you will have the ability to deploy an in-place upgrade. An in-place upgrade is effectively a package, and you will execute the package on the client. Just to qualify that, I'll System Center 2007, or Config Manager 2007 for a second, because the logical question is, if it's just a package and I'm deploying it, surely I can do a package deployment with Config Manager 2007. There were investments in 2012 in the client that basically introduced the servicing mode, if I can call it that, where we were able to do an operating system upgrade and preserve the integrity and then get the client to repair its WMI repository. Config Manager 2007 doesn't have that. So you may be able to package and deploy the in-place upgrade. Once that occurs, you've lost manageability on the client. So it's really just not in the client to be able to sustain an OS rebuild, right? So that's the challenge with being able to manage a Windows 10 device after a deployment, and that's why there's no deployment up in that cell, no check mark, I beg your pardon. But everything else you'll be able to manage. Now, let me caveat this, and this was also made clear on the blog as well. Any existing functionality in Configuration Manager 2012, R2 or SP1, will effectively be continued for Windows 10. If you need to manage the new features in Windows 10, then you're really going to need to consider Config Manager vNext. So it is a little tricky, but that's kind of the direction that you'll need to consider. Regarding the ADK, if you have 2012, when the service pack is released, then you will start to have support for integrating the Windows 10 ADK into your Configuration Manager infrastructure as well. So as mentioned, this was really just to kind of pull out the key points of the blog posting from the Configuration Manager team. Right now, you can do an in-place upgrade, and you can download the vNext Tech Preview. That's the link at the bottom of the slide once the slides are made available to you. Next week, and so I've kind of put a date in there based on the use of next week in the blog posting, that the R2 functionality will then be available, and you will have a preview of Service Pack 2. Service Pack 2 will be released. And then we've got Q4, where System Center vNext will be released, as well as this compatibility pack for Configuration Manager 2007. So that can help you with some of your timelines around commencing evaluation. So let's go to identity for a second and look at what kind of impacts we may have in that instance. And I just want to do a quick primer on Azure Active Directory and the different identity models. The first item on the left there is the cloud identity. In this scenario, all of the identity only resides in an Azure Active Directory instance, tenant. At that point, all authentication and authorization basically occurs through that directory. For what we see most customers implement is the synchronized identity, where the synchronization engine, and there have been a few, there's been DirSync, there's been Azure AD Directory Sync, and then there's Azure Active Directory Connect that is currently in pre-release. Through those, we will take identity that is on-prem and particular data and replicate it to the cloud. Equally, if you enable the reverse replication, we will sync back content to your on-prem Active Directory. That really tries to preserve the single sign-on experience because the user's identity or the user's identifier, their UPN, combined with their password hash is effectively the same. However, the subtlety in this is that depending on where the user is physically, they will be authorized against that system. So if the user is out at home with no VPN and needs to access a service that's out on a cloud service that you have, they will be authenticated against Azure Active Directory. If they're on the internal network and they need to access a resource, they will be authenticated against Active Directory, which is where the third model comes in, the federated identity. You basically bring all of the authorization, all of the authentication to one point, which has typically been on-prem, using Active Directory federation services in a farm or multi-server configuration. So what we're really looking at here is 3 options for achieving a common identity, 3 options to be able to ensure that an identity is present in the cloud, which can be leveraged by Microsoft Intune, Office 365, CRM, any of our software as a service federation partners as well. And what we're really looking at here is, regardless of where the Windows 10 device is, we can reach it. One of the key points here is that to use the business store and to have a user do a cloud domain join and work in that manner, you need to have an Azure Active Directory identity for that user. So it is one area to start to think about, that if you don't have identities in the cloud and you're thinking that Windows 10 can help with your mobility story, you will need an identity in the cloud. Now, in the disconnected scenarios, there are ways to perform those operations and management of store applications offline, but I think there's a far more detailed session on the Windows Store. So just to look at Microsoft Intune really quickly, we spoke about the CSPs earlier on, and that's really the interface to be able to read, set, and get information. SyncML is the XML schema that is used to be able to communicate configuration to a CSP. So what we're really trying to show here is that Intune, via the SyncML, will go down to the MDM client. That will go to the CDC, if you remember our architecture from the previous slide, and then that executes against the particular MDM CSP. So just to kind of dive in a little bit, there are basically 4 things I'm going to call out. One is SyncML is the entire bit of XML you see on here. It has a sync header and a sync body. And then those 3 red pieces, if I might be so bold as to say, it's effectively, dear device, please at this location set this value. That's really all it is. Everything else is part of the schema for SyncML. So that's really the quick way to read it. This is one that sets a minimum device, the minimum password length to 6 characters. So the SyncML can actually be decoded relatively easily. So let's kind of drop in and have a look at this cloud domain join piece. So just to describe the infrastructure that I have configured and to look at the scenario. I have an Azure Active Directory tenant. That tenant has been configured to permit the cloud domain join, and any user has been permitted to be able to do that. You can restrict which users can cloud domain join devices. So the scenario is effectively, I have a device or I've been provided with a device that needs to be enrolled into this cloud domain. So let's switch. Okay, so we're going to continue to use our just recently re-provisioned device, and we're going to go to the system section. If I go to About, you'll see down here there's a join a domain, which is the good old tried and tested DOM join, if I can call it that. And then we've got this connect to cloud. So let's try and kick off the connect to cloud piece. Also, if you have a device that has actually come, that has just been unboxed, there is an out-of-box experience workflow to this as well. It basically starts by excuse me. It starts by prompting the user to make a choice between whether the device is owned by the company or whether the device is a personal device. If the company-owned device choice is made, they effectively run through pretty much the same workflow you're going to see here. So we'll click continue on that. Now, I also have Azure Active Directory Premium configured for my AAD instance. What I've done is I've configured multi-factor authentication. So now I am a user who has something in here, I hope, and I have my phone with me, which will give me a one-time password through the Azure Multi-Factor Auth tool, which is available on pretty much every platform. So I will provide my details. I'm not running Federation, so it won't redirect me to my corporate Federation server. If I did have Federation at this point, I would have been redirected. So it's prompting me for that verification code. Here's the app kind of running on my phone. I'll try and get the OTP as soon as I can type it in. And we click next. So at this point, it's effectively establishing the relationship between the device and the domain. Once this has been done, the user that performs the cloud domain join is automatically added to the local administrators group. There is functionality which I noticed went live, I think, late last week or over the weekend, which now allows you within Azure Active Directory to configure which users or which group will also be added to the local admin group. So you're not going to lose control of that device in that scenario. So you'll see right now it's changed to leave organization. So at this point, I have associated the test user's Azure Active Directory account with a local account, kind of in the same way in Windows 8.1, where you were able to associate your Microsoft account with your local account. So that's effectively the cloud domain join that's just been performed. But I need to manage this device. So to do that, I will jump back out here to the system. I'll go to Accounts. I'll go to Work or School. And you'll see two things here. One is there's the Connect to Workplace, and also down here there's Add or Remove a Package for Work or School. So if I have a look in here, I should actually see there's the Enterprise Upgrade package that we installed earlier. And if we have a look at the details, it basically says who the author was and what package was named. Of course, this is still in development, so you'll see it hasn't really got the details there. So that's one way that you can tell that a provisioning package has been installed. There are ways to secure that package to ensure either that it's the last package that's ever provisioned to that device or that your package cannot be removed. So there are different ways to secure that package in place. What we're going to do is we're going to connect or enroll the device into Windows Microsoft Intune. And again, that's going to go out. It will perform an auto discovery. We'll try and find the enterprise enrollment domain suffix. Once that's discovered, it will then prompt me to log in at this point. So it's pretty much the same process that we went through earlier on. This is a different service, so I will get prompted for a new token. and it will go through and enroll the device. Once that device is enrolled, the MDM agent will perform an enumeration on the local device and then ship the information up to Intune, at which point it's basically manageable. So it's an MDM endpoint as far as Intune is concerned. Now, if you think about it, a provisioning package could have done all of that for us. That's basically the goal, is that it will be able to cloud domain join a device, or it will be able to bootstrap that configuration directly into your MDM server, MDM service. So how do we think you should probably be thinking about getting ready for the mobile solutions with Windows 10? The key part to this, as I've shown, is Azure Active Directory, and that common identity is the pivotal piece. Without that, almost everything kind of collapses on itself. The device itself, depending on whether it is a full-blown tablet or desktop, whether it is a Windows 10 mobile device. The device is effectively the endpoint, and you need to consider whether an off-the-shelf device is suitable or whether it's something that you're going to provide. So what's the device strategy in the organization? Are you still going to purchase those devices and provide it to users? Or is the BYOD, bring your own Windows device model, something that may be suitable for the organization? Today, if you don't have an MDM, we would suggest you consider one. Provisioning can only really go so far. It's not really an enterprise management tool. It is really focused at being able to bootstrap into your MDM, being able to bootstrap identity, or be able to set that device up so that it can be managed by an enterprise solution. That's not to say that provisioning packages cannot be distributed to a small number of systems. It just gets very unwieldy after that. And you would have seen through the architecture that the provisioning engine is effectively interacting via that CDC with the CSPs. So the MDM solution and provisioning packages basically end up at the same place. They're just different entry points. And then there's the data protection and the access methods. Ultimately, mobility is all about, let me get at my data from wherever I can, if you know who I am. So given that we've gone through the identity piece and potentially you've got some kind of multi-factor auth, or, let's hope you all kind of go, yep, we're going to go with Passport and Windows Hello, then those are decisions that will potentially affect your mobility strategy and your agility to get to Windows 10. The data protection piece, Azure RMS or third-party solutions are definitely in play, but you do want to really ensure that you have some level of data protection in place. Windows 10 is going to give you that out of the box, as you would have seen at the keynote yesterday with enterprise data protection, and those two integrate, well, EDP combined with Azure RMS integrate to be able to deliver that seamless experience. So securing the device and managing the device, managing your applications, and then the data piece in the middle. So it's all really been plugged across with Windows 10. So what we would suggest is start to think about this bottom up to really understand how ready you are to be able to deploy Windows 10 in that mobile scenario. So kind of starting to summarize a lot of what we've spoken about. And I have two of these. I'm going to talk about the mod. This is really the lift and shift. So I think my slide title is a bit erroneous here. This is the lift and shift model. It's what's the minimum that I need to do to get to Windows 10. So really the minimum is take what I have and run it on Windows 10 because I get some benefits from Windows 10 itself, with a view to maybe taking that extra step later on. So we spoke about the device, and we noted that firmware changes, disk layout changes, and a whole slew of others is an area that we really need to consider. We would strongly encourage you to consider UEFI as a standard, perhaps even start to look at changing some of your devices as you provision them. But UEFI really forms the basis of secure boot and trusted boot to be able to get us to the device guard state if you so choose to go down that path. The image itself. Think about where the in-place upgrade can support you think about where it can't support you, and then try and divide that up, because the in-place upgrade, as I've shown you with some of that data from Microsoft IT, can really make you a little more agile in that space and drive I guess I'll call it a customer pull of the operating system as compared to the big push that IT basically has had to do with regards to deploying an image and migrating data and looking at forward schedules of change and all of those other elements that go with a wonderful desktop deployment. The impacts, and these are really the orange-colored items through this slide, is the areas that you need to think about. So I'm trying to summarize basically the entire slide deck on one slide, if you like. MDT, there will need to be an update. If you're changing architectures and configuration, you're going to need to rework your image. And if you have that configuration drift that we spoke about earlier on. To look at your infrastructure elements that are based on Windows Server, you will need to update your policy definitions. So you will need the Windows 10 ADMX files. WSUS will get an update to be able to support Windows 10 fully. And for activation, there will also be an update for the KMS to be able to, as well as requiring a new Windows 10 key, of course. If we look at the server software, we've spoken about Configuration Manager, so I'll just kind of leave that excuse me, at that point. I do want to call out Dart specifically if you do use the Disaster Data and Recovery Toolkit. Dart is based on Windows PE, which is part of the operating system, effectively. With every operating system that we've released since Dart has been part of MDOP, there has been a complementary release of Dart as well. So expect that Dart will be updated to support Windows 10 closer to the time of release. AppV and UEV, there are some changes. I would recommend a session by Aaron Ruckman, I think it is, on Friday, where he will go into the deeper details of UEV and AppV, and excuse me, as well as what will be supported for Windows 10. So if you now want to extend with Windows 10, if you want to adopt some of those more advanced features that we spoke about, for deployment, if you're thinking about provisioning, you are going to need a new ADK. Wicked is going to have to be the tool of choice, so you're changing your tool from WSIM. But WSIM will continue to remain in the ADK, but there's an impact that you might just need to assess in terms of tooling, especially if you're using WSIM in scripts. The MDM service is something you may want to consider if you don't have one today. Do think about it, do consider having it, because it is really more of an enterprise service than trying to use provisioning across an entire organization. For management, Config Manager vNext, that's what you will need to consider to manage the new features in Windows 10, as well as being able to use an MDM solution that supports Windows 10. Microsoft is working very closely with all the major MDM vendors to be able to get them to support Windows 10 as soon as they can. For the security elements, virtualization-based security, this, as I mentioned earlier on, this leverages the hypervisor to create a totally isolated excuse me, environment where hashes and passwords can be managed, and that will basically ensure that the virtual secure mode, if you like, is actually isolated from attacks at the operating system level. So if the parent partition is compromised, that virtual secure container still remains intact. Its security isn't compromised. And there's a session by Chris Hallam that will talk in a little bit more detail about that. And then there's Device Guard and Enterprise Data Protection. Device Guard is basically a way for you to lock down a system so that only signed applications can run on that system. Think of it as App Locker, but you need to sign your applications and lock that system down. And Device Guard has a lot more than just App Locker, but it operates with UEFI and Secure Boot as well. And then there's the EDP pieces that will require some changes, and both of those depend on Secure Boot and Trusted Boot. We have a question.
While you're on security, I'm wondering what TPM2, what does that bring over 1.2, which is only
you very much. So the question is, what's the benefits of a TPM 2.0 as compared to a TPM 1.2? I would love to answer that question, but unfortunately I can't. So I will try and get that information, but I'm pretty certain that it will comply with the TCG spec. So the TCG website, the Trusted Computing Group website, will have a list of the big changes between 1.2 and 2. We'll have a chat after the session, and I'll grab your details, and we'll get an answer out to you as well in terms of how Windows 10 will leverage 2.0 features. Okay? And then there's Microsoft Passport and Windows Hello. They will use Azure Active Directory if you're using that particular configuration. Azure AD Connect to be able to perform the replication of the necessary objects and data, as well as a PKI environment. So that's really the areas where it would be impacted. And as I mentioned, there are potential AD schema or domain controller, Windows 10 domain controllers that will be required. And then if we go back down to the device, finally, to support all of this, UEFI 2.3.1 or later, which is really when UEFI really became fairly more consistent and we were able to leverage it in deployments, TPM 1.2 or later, and then virtualization extensions to support the virtual secure mode and biometric readers to be able to support Windows Hello and Passport. Windows Hello. I want to go back to one area that you will need to think about, and more information will come out on this, I guess, in the coming months. As part of the Insider program, we've published that we're basically doing quality-based releases. And this kind of follows the model in the Insider program where you've been receiving flights. And the way it works is engineering basically works as hard as they can and test within their organization. When a certain set of quality metrics are met, it's released to a wider set of testers internally. And it keeps continuing in that kind of quality-based release. That is how we will release Windows 10. And I think some disclosures have been made around when Windows 10 releases and one update thereafter. So as we go through the development cycle, and what you're experiencing right now is effectively this quality-based release. The hundreds of thousands is the limited external flights. That's really the Windows Insider program, and we've got the fast and the slow uptake. So you can kind of think of the limited external flights as being split to get a fast and a slow. The early adopters and the late early adopters. And then it continues to go out until we effectively, before we get to the business end of things, we've really been through hundreds of millions of users using the operating system. So we're really ensuring that quality is the prime directive, if I can say that, to try and get us to a point where it is ready for your business. And of course, I'm sure that at some point we're going to be able to have to iterate on that as well. The long-term servicing branch is pretty much, if I can kind of paint it in a way, the way Windows 7 works today, where you get an operating system and then we service it with hotfixes, and all of these will continue to receive hotfixes. So this quality-based release is something that you need to think about within your organization, about how you would segment devices, how you would segment users, how you would segment worker types. Where are they tolerant for change and where are they not? The long-term servicing branch is really targeted at the mission-critical scenarios. In other words, I am supporting emergencies. These devices are supporting, life. They're supporting manufacturing processes, and there's a potential for danger or a threat to life. And that's really the mission critical that we're kind of thinking, or large system control where outages are just intolerable. I don't know that necessarily, and your feedback would be absolutely valuable through all of your Microsoft representatives. What mission critical kind of means to you, and whether me working every day in an office kind of, or as a mobile worker, getting a flight. We had one challenge where we were delivering something over the weekend, and 15 minutes before the session, the flight started. right, at one of the presenter systems, flighted. Now, would we consider that mission critical? Probably not. But it was rather inconvenient at the time. So the release method, the control systems on that are being developed. They're being grown up. And so I think there's some areas where the quality-based release will need to be understood, and you will need to think about how it impacts your organization. So that's really it from me. I hope I've been able to address a whole lot of items in your infrastructure that you may need to think about. Please do complete an eval. I'd love to hear whether I was on the spot in terms of trying to address those queries. Yes, sir. We have a question.
Explain a little bit about where System Center Configuration Manager versus the MDM is sort of seen, positioned.
Sure. So the question is, do I want to explain where Configuration Manager versus MDM? So Configuration Manager will operate really in the enterprise. That's really where it's being positioned. With Windows 10, it will be extended to take advantage of the MDM subsystems and the CSPs and that WMI bridge that I showed you off in the infrastructure slide. So it will continue to operate in that manner. However, Config Manager doesn't necessarily have a reach to all the devices outside the organization. So it will depend on what your architecture is. Config Manager also does not communicate with OMA-DM natively. Microsoft Intune does. So when you pair those two together, you've effectively got the full control and configuration management of devices that can be managed via WMI, let's call it that, and those that can be controlled via OMA-DM. So really, in terms of what the device ecosystem looks like, you have your domain join systems that will remain relatively static, and you will have the mobile devices that we can't install an agent on, right? So effectively, we're in a position where between Intune and Configuration Manager, we're covering all devices. Does that answer your question? Yep. Question?
So with Office 365, there's going to be a version of Intune that comes with it. Is that going to be sufficient as an MDM for this, or do we have to get the full-blown Intune package?
Okay, so the question is, Office 365 has MDM capabilities, and will that be sufficient for this? That is a great question. I don't have an answer for you. But effectively, the Office 365 MDM capability is leveraging Microsoft Intune. Right? Okay. Any more questions? Going once, going twice? Oh, yeah.
Azure domain join? Azure domain join, or to join the...
Yeah, the cloud domain join.
Cloud domain join.
Yeah.
What kind of resources can you get access to if you log in to a like on-premise user on a computer that is joined that way?
So the question is, what kind of resources can you access by using this, by performing a cloud domain join? What you're effectively getting is the ability to register that device with the organization. Think of it as workplace join on-prem, and the organization becomes aware of that device. It also becomes a trusted device for that user. So if you look in the Azure AD portal, you'll actually see that it's registered to that user. So you can track the device that the user is using. You can manage that device, as well as based on claims that you may want to process for the resource, you may require that a device is cloud domain joined before you grant access to that resource. Okay? Sure. Yes. Right. So the question is, if we need to change from BIOS to UEFI, what's the impact on BitLocker? There is a process to that, effectively, where you're going to have to suspend BitLocker. But if you're changing from BIOS to UEFI, you won't be able to boot the operating system, right? So it's effectively a user state migration off the box, change your firmware, and then reinstall the operating system.
Is there a downside to enabling UEFI if you're running Windows 7 64-bit now?
Like I said, in the time frame that Windows 7 was released, UEFI wasn't terribly grown up. Now I think it is. Yes, I think you'll need to conduct some testing with your image if you're using one, but that will set you up in the right way. Yes. It's not no, but on your existing fleet until Windows 10 is released, that kind of gets you on the right path. Yes, that's one less criteria you have for not going to an in-place upgrade, right? Yeah.
What's the strategy and roadmap for VDI?
So, I was meant to attend a presentation, I didn't. My bad. On some of the improvements in the VDI space, I know that there are. I don't know how significant or how insignificant they are.
It seems like the TPM module is going to be showstopper, right? VDI or actually virtualized?
Well, no. So I mentioned virtual secure mode. Virtual secure mode is one of the mitigations for that. Yeah. Okay. No. Yeah.
Let's say a scenario where I have machines installed with the image and the run by is not UEFI.
Mm-hmm.
So I have to wipe out reload.
Correct.
But I'm getting new machines
Mm-hmm.
with OEM
Yeah.
and they are UEFI.
Yeah.
In that case, I can do an in place
Correct.
while in the others I have to wipe and reload. So
Yes.
I could have two task sequences, or I can have I have two images.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, you'll need to re-image,
Image.
or you'll have to create an image if you're going directly to 10. If you have an image today, you'll need to provide support for UEFI in that image to be able to deploy it.
But if I take the OEM machine,
Mhm.
plus F12, I get Pixie, I go, and then I have to task sequence that
Yes.
doesn't in place. It
Correct.
will work.
Yep.
And it will remove all the OEM and this.
In an in-place upgrade?
Yeah.
No.
No.
An in-place upgrade will migrate applications and data and drivers.
Will migrate everything.
So I think you can control. No, there's actually no control on the switches unless you do it manually.
Yeah.
Right.
But I could still use this scan test to extract the drivers. And
Yes, you could.
Make a new image and then wipe
Yes.
in place.
Yes.
Yeah, that's it.
We're working with OEMs to try and get them to a point where their applications are put in as a provisioning package.
Yeah.
Now, they could choose to have those packages as non-removable packages, in which case you've got to wipe and load, or
From the OEM, we only want the drivers.
there you go.
So,
Yes.
So we want the scan test, make a provisioning package, put it in the image, and then we can do it in place.
Sure. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
No
Great
worries.
presentation.
Thank you very much.